There is someone who thinks about you in the hours when the world goes quiet, not during the busy parts of the day when distraction is easy and life fills every corner of the mind, but in the in-between moments, the ones that sneak up on a person, the drive home when a song comes on and something in the chest tightens without warning, the moment right before sleep when the mind stops performing and finally tells the truth. The Sunday afternoon that feels heavier than it should for no reason anyone could easily explain. In those moments, this person thinks about you, and they have been thinking about you for far longer than you know. But here is what I want you to stay with me for, because this is not a simple story about someone missing you. That would be too small, too easy, too surface level for what is actually happening inside them. What is unfolding in this person right now goes much deeper than missing. It touches something Carl Jung spent his entire life trying to put into language. The idea that the things we refuse to feel do not disappear. They descend. They sink into the unconscious like stones into still water. And they weigh there patient and heavy until the weight becomes too much to carry in silence. That is where this person is right now, carrying something they buried, carrying something they convinced themselves they had already released, and slowly, painfully, beginning to understand that they never released it at all. I want you to stay close to this, because what I am about to walk you through is not just about them. It is about a pattern. A psychological pattern that lives inside the space between two people when one of them is afraid of what they feel, when one of them loves deeply but does not yet know how to be in that love without flinching, without protecting themselves at the cost of protecting the connection. You may have felt this pattern from the outside. You may have stood inside it, wondering what was wrong with you, wondering why presence felt inconsistent, wondering why warmth came in waves and then retreated, wondering if you imagined the depth you felt between you. You did not imagine it. What you felt was real, and what they felt was real. The problem was never the feeling. The problem was what they did with it. Jung wrote about something he called the shadow, the part of a person that holds everything they cannot yet face about themselves, the fears that are too sharp to look at directly, the needs that feel too exposed to admit, the longings that feel too dangerous to speak aloud. And here is the thing about the shadow that most people never understand. It does not just hold the darkness. It also holds the light a person has not yet learned to carry. Their capacity for love, their capacity for vulnerability, their capacity for genuine connection. All of it gets buried together when fear takes over. And when a person buries their shadow instead of facing it, that buried self begins to run their life from underground. That is what happened here. This person did not pull away from you because they did not feel enough. They pulled away because they felt more than they knew what to do with, more than their nervous system had ever been asked to hold, more than any previous version of their life had prepared them for. And when we encounter something that powerful, something that asks us to be fully seen, fully present, fully responsible for another person's heart, the most human response in the world is fear. Not cruelty, not indifference, fear. The kind that looks like coldness from the outside but feels like drowning on the inside. And you felt that, didn't you? You felt the distance and asked yourself what you had done wrong. You replayed conversations. You measured your words more carefully. You softened yourself in places you did not need to soften. You reached out when you should have been reached for. And slowly, quietly, something in you began to understand that no amount of adjustment on your part was going to fix what was happening inside of them. Because what was happening inside of them had nothing to do with anything you failed to be. It had everything to do with what they had not yet become. Now, something has shifted. Something happened recently that cracked the surface of everything they had been maintaining, and I do not mean cracked in a dramatic way. I mean cracked in the way that a hairline fracture forms, invisible at first, running deeper than it appears, until one morning you press your hand against the wall and feel it give. That is the kind of shift I am describing. Something small triggered it. Maybe your name came up somewhere unexpected. Maybe they saw something that belonged to a memory of you. Maybe life simply became quiet enough that they could no longer outrun the noise inside their own chest. Whatever it was, it worked the way the unconscious always works. Not with announcements, with a feeling, sudden, heavy, and undeniable. The feeling was this: they may lose you. Not in the abstract way that thought had floated through their mind before and been pushed aside, but in the real way, in the permanent way, in the way that means doors close and do not reopen, in the way that means life continues and people become strangers, and what once existed becomes something that only one person carries while the other moves forward and forgets to look back. That realization did not arrive with gentleness. It arrived with weight. And now, I want to tell you something important about that weight, because this is where the psychology gets layered, and I need you to hold both truths at the same time without collapsing them into something simpler than they are. The urgency they feel right now is real. The regret is real. The longing is real. And some portion of what they are feeling is genuine love, the kind that was always there beneath the silence and the distance and the fear. That part is true. But there is another layer underneath it. And ignoring that layer would not be honest. And you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfort. Part of what they are feeling right now is not about you at all. Part of it is about them. Part of it is the ego recognizing that something it took for granted is disappearing. Part of it is the psyche confronting the consequences of its own avoidance and recoiling from what it sees. Part of it is the attachment system in the human brain activating in response to perceived loss. The same system that makes people want what they ignored until it started moving away. Jung called this the shadows awakening. The moment a person is finally forced to look at what their fear created, and it is painful. It is real. But pain and genuine transformation are not the same thing. Regret and readiness are not the same thing. And longing is not automatically the same as love. I want you to hold that distinction carefully as we continue, because what happens next in this story depends entirely on which parts of this are real and which parts are simply reaction. Here is what they would tell you if pride had no voice, if fear had no seat at the table, if every wall they had ever built between themselves and intimacy could be set aside for just one honest moment. They would tell you that they did not know how to be in something real without destroying it. That love, for them, had always arrived packaged with loss somewhere nearby. That vulnerability had always felt less like a doorway and more like an exposed nerve. That every time they got close to something meaningful, they found a way to create distance before the inevitable disappointment could arrive and find them unprepared. They would tell you that you were different, not in the way people say that as a performance, in the way a person feels it somewhere beneath language, the way you listened, not waiting for your turn to speak, but actually present, actually inside the conversation with them. The way you seemed to understand things they had not fully articulated yet. The way you held space for their contradictions without demanding they resolve themselves on your timeline. The way you offered honesty without weaponizing it. The way your care did not come with conditions wrapped around its edges. Those things frightened them, and I know that sounds backward. I know that when someone offers you exactly what you have been searching for, fear should dissolve, not expand. But for someone whose nervous system learned early that love and loss travel together, safety can feel more threatening than danger. Danger is familiar. They know how to survive it. They have survived it before. But being genuinely seen, being genuinely loved without the performance, without the armor, without the carefully constructed version of themselves they show the world, that is unfamiliar territory, and we are all, at some level, creatures of the familiar, even when the familiar is painful. So, they did what people do when they encounter something that feels too real. They created distance, not because they wanted to leave, because they were afraid of what would happen if they stayed and failed, because some part of them whispered that it was better to withdraw by choice than to be abandoned without one. That whisper was the shadow speaking. It was the unconscious running its oldest program, and they followed it without questioning it because it felt like self-protection, even though it was self-sabotage, dressed in familiar clothing. And you felt all of this. You might not have had the language for it at the time, but you felt the temperature change. You felt the subtle withdrawals. You felt the moments when presence was right there, almost close enough to hold, and then something shifted and the distance returned. And you stayed. Not because you were weak, because you are the kind of person who believes in people, the kind who holds space even when it costs something, the kind who looks beneath behavior and tries to understand what is driving it, the kind who gives the benefit of the doubt not from naivety, but from genuine emotional intelligence. But something changed in you too, and this part matters more than any other part of what I am telling you today. It did not happen dramatically. There was no single moment of decision. There was no confrontation, no ultimatum, no final conversation that drew a clean line between before and after. It happened the way most real transformation happens inside a woman's heart. Gradually, quietly, through accumulation, through the slow and steady addition of unanswered silences and inconsistent presences and small disappointments that individually seemed manageable but collectively built something that eventually became unmovable. One day, you simply stopped carrying the whole weight of it alone. You stopped filling every silence with your own hope. You stopped translating their behavior into the best possible version of what it could mean. You stopped showing up to a dynamic that required everything from you and offered uncertainty in return. You stopped building your emotional world around someone else's readiness, and you turned, slowly, back toward yourself. That shift is why they are afraid right now. Not afraid of you, precisely. Afraid of what you represent now. You represent the thing they avoided facing by avoiding you. You represent the cost of their own fear. And more than anything, more than the loss of your company or your care or even the specific warmth you offered them, they are afraid of what your calm reveals about where you now stand. Because you are no longer reaching, you are no longer adjusting, you are no longer softening yourself to fit a space that was never shaped to hold you properly, and they can feel that, the way a room can feel empty even before anyone speaks. The way a season can change in a single afternoon. Something about your energy is different now. Something about your silence carries a different weight. It no longer sounds like waiting. It sounds like someone who has arrived somewhere new and settled in, and they are still standing where you left them. That is the image I want you to hold for a moment, because it is important. They are standing in the same place, carrying the same fear. Only now the view has changed. Now they can see you moving forward, and the distance between where they are and where you're going is becoming impossible to ignore. Let me tell you what lives inside that fear, at the very center of it, under the ego, under the pride, under the self-protection and the explanations they have rehearsed and the apologies they have composed and deleted without sending. At the very center of it is a recognition. A recognition that you offered them something most people never receive and most people never fully understand the value of until it is already moving away from them. You offered them the experience of being known, not the performance of being known, not the surface-level intimacy that comes from shared activity and comfortable habits. The real thing. The thing where another person sees into the parts of you that you usually keep dark and quiet. And they do not recoil. They do not judge. They do not weaponize it later. They simply hold it, with care, with steadiness, with the kind of love that does not require a person to be any different than they actually are in order to receive it. That is what you gave them, and that is what they are beginning to understand. They threw away every time they chose distance over presence, every time they chose silence over honesty, every time they chose the familiar safety of emotional unavailability over the terrifying and beautiful risk of being fully in something with another person. And now they want to reach out. They have thought about reaching out more times than you would believe. They have written beginnings of messages and stopped. They have rehearsed conversations that never left the interior of their own mind. They have imagined your response in 100 different ways and used each imagined rejection as one more reason to stay silent. And in the meantime, you have been living your life, building yourself, moving forward, growing into the version of yourself that no longer needs their confirmation to know your own worth. Which brings me to the part of this that is really about you. Because everything I have told you about them is true. The regret is real. The fear is real. The longing is real. The realization of what they had and what their choices cost is real and present and alive inside them right now. All of that is true, and none of it is your responsibility. You're not required to hold space for someone's growth while they are still mid-process. You're not required to wait while someone figures out whether you are worth showing up for. You're not required to absorb someone's regret as though it cancels out what their behavior created. You're not required to make yourself available simply because someone has finally recognized your value. Recognition is not the same as transformation. Regret is not the same as change. The feeling of loss is not automatically the beginning of real and sustained emotional presence. Here is what Jung understood about love that most of us are never taught. He understood that we do not fall in love with a person. We fall in love with a projection, an image we cast onto another person from inside our own unconscious, from our dreams, our wounds, our deepest longings, our unmet needs. And for a while, the other person seems to perfectly embody everything we have been searching for, until life makes demands, until vulnerability becomes necessary, until the projection begins to separate from the real human being standing in front of us. And that is where real love either begins or ends. Real love is not the projection. Real love is what remains after the projection falls away. After you see the actual person, flawed and frightened and full of contradictions, and choose to remain anyway. Not from desperation, not from fear, but from genuine recognition. The question is not whether this person has feelings for you. They do. The question is not whether they regret their choices. They do. The question is whether they are capable right now, in this version of themselves, of meeting you where you have arrived, of offering you the consistency and the presence and the honest emotional accountability that a real connection requires. Not in theory, not in apology, in daily, consistent, sustained action. Only they can answer that. And only you can decide whether their answer, whatever it turns out to be, is something you want to make room for in the life you are building. Because here is the truth that this entire message has been moving toward. The real power in this situation was never theirs to hold. It was always yours, not the power of withholding, not the power of punishment, the power of knowing your worth so clearly and so deeply that the behavior of any other person can no longer define what you believe you deserve. The power of a woman who has done her own work, who has looked honestly at her own patterns, who has stopped confusing intensity for love and longing for compatibility and someone else's fear for evidence of her own inadequacy. That woman is not waiting to be chosen. She has already chosen herself. And that is the thing they feel when they sense the shift in you. That is what unnerves them more than any argument or confrontation or emotional expression ever could, because a woman who has chosen herself does not need to be loud about it. She simply moves differently, thinks differently, decides differently. She no longer organizes her worth around someone else's readiness to recognize it. She carries herself with the quiet certainty of someone who finally stopped looking outside herself for the confirmation she always already had the right to give herself. You arrived at that. Through everything you endured, through every moment of confusion and unanswered silence and hope extended past the point it should have been, you arrived at yourself. And whatever this person decides to do, whether they find the courage to reach out, whether they stay silent, whether they eventually do the real internal work that would allow them to offer you something genuine, none of it changes the most important truth in all of this. You are no longer the person who waits to be seen. You are the person who has learned to see clearly. You are no longer the person who filled silence with hope at the cost of your own peace. You are the person who finally chose their own peace as the starting point rather than the reward at the end. You are no longer the person who adjusted their worth to match someone else's ability to recognize it. You are the person who has settled quietly and permanently into the reality of your own value. That is the awakening on this side of the story, and it is the only awakening that was ever truly yours to claim. Whatever comes next, whatever they choose, whatever doors open or remain closed, walk forward from that place. Walk forward from clarity rather than confusion, from peace rather than need, from the version of yourself who knows that real love does not ask you to disappear into uncertainty. It meets you where you actually are, with honesty, with presence, with the willingness to be fully seen even when being seen is the most terrifying thing in the world. That is what you were always offering, and now, at last, you are offering it to the most important person it was ever meant to reach, yourself.